Welcome back, everyone. For those who've joined us more recently, I'm Sarah Imond, ICER's President and CEO, and now it is time for our policy roundtable. I'm so appreciative of the experts who have taken time to be with us today. The point of the policy roundtable is to really digest what we just heard. We heard a presentation of the evidence on effectiveness, on value. We talked about benefits beyond health and other ethical priorities. And we saw what the Midwest CEPAC thought about that evidence through their votes. And we're going to be reflecting on all of that today with an end goal of producing a set of policy recommendations that will help us to know how we can have evidence-based policy around the introduction of this new medicine. So it's my pleasure to introduce or to invite our policy roundtable to introduce themselves. And if I could, Vicki, I'd like to start with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this discussion. I'm Vicki Brown. I am our Associate Vice President for Clinical Drug Strategy at Humana, and that is my only conflict of interest.
Thank you, Vicki. It's great to have you here. Jamie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Rubin Cahill. I lead the Health Economics and Outcomes Research Department at Vertex. That is my conflict of interest, pretty obvious one.
Really thrilled to have you here, Jamie. Thank you. David.
Hi, I'm David Doan, Medical Director for Pharmacy at Point 32 Health, which is a regional healthcare company in Boston. That's my only conflict of interest, and I'm practicing in internal medicine.
Thank you so much. Now, people who've been with us throughout the day have heard from Ben, Nicole, Andrew, and Gabe, but let's just give them a chance to say hello quickly for those who are just tuning in. So Ben, you first.
Hello again, Benjamin Friedman. I'm an emergency physician and an acute pain researcher from the Bronx.
And I should be careful. I am known for shortening names even when people don't like it. So is Ben okay?
Yes, that is perfectly fine. Thank you.
All right, Benjamin's. I can say that. I can do extra syllables. All right. Thank you for being here, Nicole.
Hello, everyone. Nicole Hemingway. I am the CEO of the U.S. Pain Foundation. As a national nonprofit organization, we do receive funding support from healthcare companies, industry groups, family foundations, and individual donors.
Thank you, Nicole. Andrew. No, Dr. Chladni, you're on mute. Andrew, can you hear us? Can you say a quick hello and introduce yourself? Oh, I wonder if Andrew is having some technical difficulties. We'll try and figure that out. And Gabe, would you like to say hello while we get Andrew squared away?
Yes, happy to. Gabe Smith, patient, and I come via Arlington Chronic Support Group.
Thank you so much. And for those watching at home, you can see that Dr. Chladni, he's an addiction psychiatrist, and he works at the Heller School and also runs or leads a nonprofit, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing. And we are thrilled that he's here. Andrew, can you hear us now? Okay.
I can, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so I think we can take down the slides and we can start to get into our discussion. I will say for the policy roundtable participants today, you can start thinking now that about your call to action at the end of our conversation today. So you get plenty of time to think about what that might be. But we're really excited to have you all here to tackle some of these issues. What do we do with the introduction of a new, likely non-addictive painkiller? We've heard the votes from CEPAC. There's been some skepticism about its effectiveness, but there's been also some support for its effectiveness and the role that it can have in therapy, representing something that is likely non-addictive. You saw the value votes kind of split. Thinking about it, I think there's a little bit of, I don't know how to think about how well this works because of the clinical trial data. Maybe the lack of peer-reviewed published data might be playing a part in that thinking. But gosh, the real risk of opioid use disorder, even from short term, has real harm for patients. And so how do I think about something that might eliminate that harm. Those are some of the themes that we're going to hit on today. And one thing that I would like to sort of frame for our conversation also is that we haven't had a new class of pain medicine in 20-ish years, more than that. I've made jokes about how we've been kind of wanting this in terms of our innovation signal and like, why has it been so long? We've known for a while the limitations that we have with some of our therapies. And depending on where you land on the evidence and the cost effectiveness, this is a therapy that's priced to potentially be cost saving to the healthcare system. All acknowledgement of the sensitivity of the assumption of the rate of opioid use disorder from short-term therapy. But even in that context, this is one version of an opportunity for the grand bargain that we often talk about. Innovation we've been needing and wanting in the system, evidence that it works, and we can kind of quibble with how we're interpreting that evidence, and then a price that aligns with the benefit that it's demonstrating to patients and to the healthcare system. And so what we'll focus on through our conversation today are what are the policy choices that we can make and the opportunities that we have to hold up that end of the grand bargain. And we often start talking about health equity, and we're definitely going to get to that today. But I can't avoid asking each of you the big question that's been in my head as I've been thinking about this and watching the meeting today. Does this really come down to who's the appropriate patient? And if we think about the sort of clinical benefit and the value, is it really about like making that a little more clear? Nicole, I'm going to put you on the spot first. If you've thought a little bit about this, and fair game, everyone who has pain, anyone who wants it, maybe only those with a history of opioid use disorder, I'd love to hear how you're thinking about who's the appropriate patient for this new medicine.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I want us to continue to keep at the focal point of everything is that person that is experiencing pain, that is desperate for new treatment options, new novel therapeutics, really getting access even to other treatments that we have out there that maybe we just don't have the availability to. So at the focus of everything is that person that is experiencing pain, and how can we best support them and how can we help them? Right now, this is a really promising time, which is what you just said. This is a big advancement for the pain community and hopefully for pain management going forward. Who is that right person? I think that is still something that could potentially be determined. I think that there could be a lot of other disease states and pain avenues that might really benefit. But especially right now, some of the conversations we had, I think it could be beneficial for post-surgical patients. Individuals with acute injuries and maybe more on that muscle sprain side, as we were hearing, and those who really can't tolerate certain medications such as NSAIDs or opioids. So I'm just really, really happy to be here. And I really am hopeful that this could bring about some very promising change and relief and improved quality of life for millions of Americans that are living with pain.
Love that. Thank you, Nicole. Gabe, going to go to you for anything you want to kind of round out on that, and even how you've been thinking about this in your own journey.
Absolutely. So my introduction to pain medications was, I don't remember the specific first instance, but it was an ER trip when I was younger and ended up with a bottle of opioids. And that was the first time I had them. It eventually led to some dependency after some medical issues in my early 20s, which I was, through a lot of hard work, able to kick. And then unfortunately, I suffered a new injury May of this last year, and I'm back on opioids. And having to go back onto something, and now I know I'm talking about the chronic side of things, but to switch over now and talk about the acute side of things.
Yeah.
There are so many of these injuries that I know we're now treating with less opiates, but less does not mean zero. And there's so many of these of injuries that don't require an opiate. Speaking from a patient perspective, I fully agree with that.
Yeah.
But if it's the only option, what are we supposed to do?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think you've nailed it, Gabe. And that's how I've been kind of thinking about this too, and thinking about that appropriate patient. We mentioned this earlier in the meeting, patients who said they would take a slightly less effective medicine if it didn't come with a risk of dependence or addiction. And so even thinking, right? Yeah, thank you, Gabe. So even thinking about, again, kind of going back to some of the discussion we had on the evidence and is it better or is it just as good as, there might be an opportunity here to really meet a lot of the needs of patients if we think of it from that perspective. All right, Jamie, I worked in industry. I know you have limitations on how you might be able to answer this question, but like how, from what you guys have developed and the way you design the trials, what are you thinking in terms of the appropriate patient?
Yeah, I mean, the indication for suzetrigine is broad, moderate to severe acute pain for adults. And so I think that broad indication is indicative of both the pain models that are used to develop the drug to warrant that indication, and then where that product can be used. And, while there are some more obvious examples, I think, of where people see a very high unmet need for something like suzetrigine. So things you mentioned, like individuals that have prior history of opioid use disorder or some type of dependence, or maybe elderly patients that are at a higher risk of some of the opioid-related adverse events, although those are fairly widespread, but things like respiratory depression seem to show up more in that elderly population. I think the thing to remember is that what we are experiencing with opioids is not always predictable. And I think a lot of the stories that we hear and a lot of the data that we have suggests that it's very hard to know who is going to end up developing something like opioid use disorder or some type of dependence or prolonged opioid use over time from just a short course of opioids. And so I think there is a broad indication for a reason, and that, for people where we are looking for alternatives to opioids, and that again is broad indication of anything from a bone injury to a sports injury to a surgery to trauma. I think anytime that we have the opportunity to not prescribe somebody an opioid, that is an opportunity to not have those downstream consequences, and that is really how I think about it. So yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that's fantastic, Jamie. And you've touched on things that we're going to kind of weave in and out. Dr. Friedman, seeing patients in the ER, I think you told us previously 80% of what you see is related to pain. I could be slightly hyperbolic with that, but how are you thinking about the appropriate patient with this new medicine?
I guess I'm going to embrace both what Jamie said and what Gabe said. I'm a skeptic by nature, but I find myself surprisingly optimistic about this medication, and
we accept that energy on this roundtable. So keep that coming.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm hoping it lives up to what what the potential could be. I mean, Jamie said the indication is broad, and it certainly seems that way. I can tell you from my clinical experience, during every shift, I see half a dozen patients I would want to use this medication in. These are, so who are these patients? These are patients with a variety of acute pain, a variety of etiologies of acute pain. Much of it musculoskeletal, but radiculopathies as well. Where they've already tried, the over-the-counter and sometimes stronger medications, from the categories that we've discussed, and failed to get relief from them. And it's a clinically frustrating scenario because you don't know. I mean, it's not that you don't know what to do; it's that you don't have that many options. Once somebody's already failed, a prescription strength NSAID, plus minus acetaminophen, and they've done reasonable non-pharmacologic interventions. It's the opioids, and then it's my sort of risk benefit discussion with them, my shared decision making with them. Are we gonna risk taking the opioids or not? And so I'm very happy to have another option to introduce them to. Now, I guess we'll see over the coming the coming years, whether there is real good with the promise here is as good as I'm hoping. You know, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty now, and I'm sort of very eager to see whatever more data comes our way.
Yeah. And we'll definitely get to sort of future research needs, and that can be sort of what we would like to see from the body of evidence to make us feel more confident in some of these decisions we need to make. Dr. Kalani, what would you add in terms of the appropriate patient for this new medicine?
I see it, I guess, similar to Dr. Friedman. I think that the appropriate patient would be a patient who has either failed NSAIDs or may have a contraindication to receiving NSAIDs. I thought some of the media coverage for suzetrigine when it was approved was interesting and a little frustrating in some ways, because the media was covering it as if we finally have a non-opioid pain medicine, or we finally have a non-addictive pain medicine. Isn't this like major news? Which isn't really true. We already have non-addictive, non-opioid pain medicines that are as effective as opioids. The head-to-head studies I'm familiar with where NSAIDs have been compared to opioids, you know, NSAIDs, even for severe pain, even for conditions like renal colic, kidney stone pain, which is excruciating, the opioids, NSAIDs performed as well as the opioids with less adverse effects. So I really do think that for most acute pain, first line are NSAIDs, and then this might be second line. I still do have concerns about whether or not it's truly effective. We know that of course, we're not discussing this today, but where it was the trial for chronic pain, suzetrigine did not perform better than placebo. And my take on the bunionectomy data was, you know, to me, I was not convinced that it was more effective than placebo based on the rescue doses being similar to placebo. But I still think, yes, you know, it might be effective, but there's still a question mark there because we don't have published papers on this. So there's really not enough evidence to review. We can't really see clearly enough how the studies were done. But if this is effective, I think it's a medication you use for patients who have failed NSAIDs or can't tolerate NSAIDs.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And yes, we're going to stay away from chronic today. Totally understand that we do have that additional sort of information out there, but we're really thinking about the policy options in front of us for the acute pain setting. And so David and Vicky, we're going to have more time to like talk, what's a coverage policy going to look like? But I mean, just kind of early thinking of how you've seen this, how you think about this and all of the priorities that you have thinking about policies for appropriate patients. Vicky, let me come to you first. What are you thinking in terms of the appropriate patient?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the most important question. So I like you starting.
That's why I asked it first. But
it really goes to, you know, anytime we have a new drug to market, our process is to think about how do we get the right outcome for the right member at the right time for the right cost. Like, so at its core, this is what we want to do is figure out like, where is the evidence and how do we align and ensure that we have access in accordance with that? And so I think, you know, the opioid epidemic is obviously a public health priority. We're obviously going to need multimodal factors. And so I think uncertainty is a word that came up a lot today in terms of like how to use this and where to use that. And I think that's where we have just so many questions still to answer. And I know you said we're going to get to what those questions still are, but I think at its core, some of those things, you know, particularly as a Medicare payer primarily, we really want to see what the evidence is in the 65 and older population and being able to figure out how we apply that to our specific population that we care for. So yeah, I'll hold some of the comments on like, what are the future questions, but really that comes down to trying to help us figure out who is that right patient for this drug.
We certainly hope that by the end of this conversation, we will give you more information to help with answering that question. Then David, in terms of how you guys have started thinking about its sort of place in therapy and the appropriate patients, what comes to mind?
So I guess the biggest thing that comes to mind is it effective? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think if it's not effective, then we shouldn't necessarily be covering it. You know, originally I was very enthusiastic, then some more data came out, and I'm still, even after this, still going, how effective is it? I do think it has a place in therapy. I do worry that the default, for a variety of reasons, is just to, if you're a surgeon, it's much easier just to give one of these drugs. You don't have to think about NSAID risk. You don't have to think about checking a drug database, doing a history. Here you go. And just from a pure member point of view, there is a hazard of this medicine. It's going to be a lot more expensive for the member just based on cost sharing.
Put a pin in that, because I do want to get back to thinking about how we're thinking about that cost sharing piece. And yes, it's more expensive, but you've seen some of our modeling and what that looks like sort of long term. But Jamie, please, yes, jump in.
Yeah, I think I just have to go on the record, just reminding everybody that, suzetrigine met the primary endpoint of statistically significantly better than placebo. So that is true. And that the data that you looked at actually imputed for rescue. So it is suzetrigine as a monotherapy is the data that you're looking at. And then there is additional data that is available that I think was shared with everybody, where you look at adding the rescue to that and you see the curves go down even further. So I just want to remind everybody that that data is available and I think was provided. And, this product is safe and effective as assigned by the FDA.
And we can stipulate, well, can I make this on behalf of all of you? Probably not. Should not even attempt to try to make a stipulation on behalf. FDA approved, met the primary endpoint, has a label, as we talked about at the beginning. Acknowledging that regulatory standards are not always the same as the standards that those making decisions about coverage and access are using, because they're thinking of it more from a comparative effectiveness perspective, which is different than the standard. So we got to just acknowledge that those two standards exist. And so that's going to identify maybe some of the tension that might come up as we're thinking about how we're looking at the evidence and thinking about policy making. Dr. Kalani, did you want to jump in on that point?
I just was curious if there's a plan to publish so that we could really, so the public, the medical community could more closely examine the way the study was conducted.
Yes,
and
those
all of
are,
the data you have.
Those are underway.
Perfect. That's great. Good. I think that's going to be a helpful addition as we're all trying to make those determinations.
Yeah, and the data I was referring to was presented at the ASA just last year.
Yeah, we looked at that. That was the foundation of our review. Okay, so let's shift. I want to talk a little bit about the health equity piece, because we don't want to miss an opportunity to make sure that any policies that we're thinking about, any conclusions that we're making, don't miss that opportunity. Many of you heard the discussion from the Midwest CEPAC about its ability to address or be of substantial relevance to people from racial and ethnic groups that have not been adequately served by the healthcare system. We had 8 agree and 3 strongly agree. So the majority of the Midwest CEPAC was thinking that, yeah, this does represent that opportunity. And in our discussion, we talked a little bit about the inherent bias in prescribing that can sometimes happen. So let's just talk a little bit about what are our roles as stakeholders, different stakeholders in this system, to sort of improving equitable access, knowing that having a likely non-addictive option may change some of that biased behavior that has impacted some of the disparities that we've had. Nicole, you've probably thought about this a bit. So from the equity perspective, how are you thinking about this?
Well, I really think that it requires a collective effort from many different groups of stakeholders, because we each play a vital role in ensuring improved health outcomes and pain relief going forward. And so that starts with healthcare providers and patients, really making sure that each and both of them are informed and educated, but also looking at that shared decision making. And making sure that the individual experiencing pain also has a voice and a say and is really, really equipped with the information that they need, and that the provider and the patient together can really make sure that it's individualized for that specific person. Then we also need to look at payers, because we really need to look at expanding coverage to a host of treatments, non-pharmacologic, as well as looking at new novel treatments that are coming to market. We need to look at reducing administrative barriers, ensuring timely access to care, and really prioritizing that cost-effective solutions to benefit both the patients, but also our healthcare system in the long term. So from our perspective, a small investment today can really lead to substantial long-term benefits for the system as a whole, as well as that person. Then it goes on. I mean, we have policymakers, and we need to look at policies that are really supporting pain management research and removing barriers to care. Researchers also have a key responsibility in here, ensuring that their work is inclusive and reflective of the diverse lived experiences of all people that are living with pain. And then advocacy organizations, they play a role too in raising awareness of the challenges, but really making sure that we are providing information that's going to empower individuals, that's going to help them, and it's going to connect the community together, as well as really helping shape that fractured patient-provider relationship. And then lastly, it's sort of that broader public and really looking at reducing stigma surrounding pain, fostering greater understanding and compassion, and really making sure that individuals are equipped with the knowledge and the tools that they need to make a significant difference in their lives going forward. So it's brief, but there's so many different components.
That's perfect. And
Okay.
I mean, that gets to some of the things. One of the things that you've hit on, and as others kind of think about this, what are our collective responsibilities to ensure equitable access? And it's not just to suzetrigine. The other thing that came through to us in our review was how there are other appropriate options, the multimodal approach that might be underutilized. And that's its own disparity issue. If you can only get those if you're going to an academic medical center, then we're leaving out everybody who's in a rural setting to be able to do some of these other things, whether it's a nerve block or whatever it might be. So let's all think about what are the specific things that we can do to maybe even increase the access to multimodal while ensuring sort of equitable access. David, I'm going to go back to you because you brought up cost sharing, and so you opened that door. I mean, one view of this is that yes, it's more expensive, but if it's as good as opioids and doesn't have the risk of opioid use disorder, that actually might end up being cost saving for the system. And so then are we almost thinking of this like a gene therapy, right? Like you make all this investment up front because you have these downstream benefits that accrue to the system and to patients. But why don't you share a little bit that equitable piece, and touch on that cost issue you brought up?
Yeah, so I mean, first on the cost sharing, it's really determined by the plan's design. So generally, I can't think of an example where we change it unless it's mandated by the state that we're in, because plan design says brand name drug is X tier with X cost share. So that's not something I can control, and it's really only the state mandates that change that. I think the equitable part is very important, something we think about. When I look at this drug, I see it coming from the ED, the surgeons, because it's acute pain. And a lot of the equitable stuff that you mentioned is when people have been suffering from pain for multiple weeks. So I'm not sure if that is as much of a factor. I think the equitable part is, the ED physician's not going to put a prior authorization in for this drug.
Right.
And then there's the equitable, do you have a primary care doc who's going to actually do it for you? Well, if you have a concierge doc, maybe. But I think that's something as a plan we need to think about. How are these people going to get access to this drug who are appropriate? Opioid use disorder is real. We want to decrease that. It's a net benefit for the plan and for the society, and we need to balance those two things.
Okay, great. We're going to go back to prior auth. But Ben, as you're thinking about the sort of equitable piece of this, I mean, you're at an academic medical center. Like you're probably trying to take advantage of the multimodal as much as you can. Talk a little bit about how we can get more equitable access to this and other pain management options.
I mean, like we're saying, like everybody's saying, it's all about the money and how to convince the payers that that the long-term benefit is worth the short-term cost. And you know, I mean, I guess I guess, if the state Medicaid, the state Medicaids can be convinced to pay for it, and I think as the data emerges, they probably can be. I think that's sort of one policy approach to take. Although I guess who knows if we're still going to have Medicaid a few weeks from now. So let's see what happens. But I think wherever there are public insurers, I guess that really is the answer. Like working with the public insurers to see if more access can be obtained without a lot of work required to do it. And the states do seem very interested in this issue of opioid use disorder. So I think there probably is a good argument that can be made to them, and that might be a reasonable way to go.
Okay, I appreciate that. Anyone that I haven't touched on yet who's got a specific recommendation or idea on this sort of equitable access piece that they want to add or double click on that they've heard already? Okay, great. I'm going to shift to some questions that are sort of by stakeholder perspective, but that doesn't mean that if you have something that you want to add that you shouldn't feel shy about chiming in. I'm thinking, just turning to the patients, Gabe, I'm kind of thinking about, and I know you're not here to represent every patient who's ever experienced pain, but just in terms of, you've given this some thought, you listened to the meeting today. We've talked about the hope and the optimism that comes from a new therapy like this. Are there any worries that the patient community might have about the introduction of a new therapy like this?
Well, that's interesting, and it is hard to speak for everybody.
Definitely don't want you to, just because you've thought about this. And Nicole, I'll go to you next.
I mean, I think the one quick thought I would have is that anytime I am in a medical setting and I'm being offered this drug, that drug, familiarity is always nice. And so something that I've never heard of before in that situation can be somewhat daunting or even overwhelming.
Right.
And so good education and advocacy on it, I think, will be important if it is found to be effective.
Yep. No, I think that's kind of where my head was, to sort of what the uncertainties are. And we talked a little bit about that today, like long-term, are there risks we haven't seen yet and things like that. But Nicole, anything in that you wanted to add? Sort of what they might be worried about from a patient perspective with a new therapy?
I think it's information. I think the more informed individuals can be with published data, with conversations with their healthcare providers, the better. I think there's definitely going to be some cautious optimism. People with pain have been waiting for a really long time for new treatments to come out or to have access to treatments that might be there that we aren't utilizing enough of. And so from my perspective, I would think that people are hopeful but cautious. And we do need more information so that individuals and their providers can make the right decisions. And then also just focusing in on coverage and access after.
Got it. Gabe, please go ahead.
I would just say that, like, if the other option is the opioids and we know what the risk of the opioids is, at the same point, if I'm being given an option that is being advertised as not having even some of those, you said this earlier, and we have to emphasize that point. It's a no-brainer, and I think I can speak for just about everybody that they would take that medication every single day of the week if offered to you with even maybe not the promise of reduced, but the idea of reduced complications. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Turning to the clinical experts, you heard everyone's sort of reflection. You chimed in on appropriate patients. We also touched on this idea of things that might be underused. Dr. Kolodny, you started to talk about this a little bit, but what are some of the strategies that we can put forth in our policy recommendations to improve access to some of these other strategies for pain management? And so, Dr. Friedman, is it, do you have the ability to send somebody to get a nerve block when they show up in your ER? Is that like challenging from an operational perspective? Like, what are the system things that we need just to think about like addressing pain more adequately?
Yeah, I think unfortunately that this is a big problem because sort of the more careful and more thoughtful approaches to pain require time. It's easy to write a prescription. It's difficult to do a nerve block. I mean, some offices are set up to do it for the most part. For the majority of practitioners out there, it's difficult to take the time away from your very busy schedule to set up and do the nerve block. Similarly, for patients, it's much easier to take a pill than it is to go to physical therapy or to take half an hour to do yoga. And so I think for this reason, it's taking a pill is always going to be the easier solution. So how does one deal with this? I mean, it's got to be a healthcare system that's really invested in better long-term outcomes. And so far, I don't know that I've seen evidence that that's what our healthcare system, for the most part, is interested in. From the patient perspective, I think this has come up before, but if patients can be incentivized to make the healthcare decisions that are ultimately of most benefit. I mean, that's sort of probably sort of the behavioral economics of it would probably work out for the benefit of the population as a whole. But yeah, I mean it's tough. I mean certainly there are many times that I would prefer to take the time to do the nerve block, but I've got 20 patients waiting to see me, and I just don't have the time to do it.
Okay. So one of our policy recommendations is more hours in the day for all of us, so that we can do more yoga and do more nerve blocks. Dr. Lani, you've touched on this a little bit, but what barriers have you seen to some of the using some of the other non-opioid options to address patients' pain?
So, one of the reasons that the reason that we were over prescribing opioids was not so much that we lacked alternatives. It's that campaign that led to the very sharp increase in prescribing involved many false and misleading messages that were disseminated to the medical community. For example, that the risks of addiction were extremely low. Many people are familiar with the Porter and Jick, much less than 1% will get addicted message that Purdue Pharma disseminated directly and indirectly. But those weren't the only, that wasn't the only misinformation about the downplaying the risks of opioids. There was also an exaggeration of the risks of competing treatments like NSAIDs. So the risks of NSAIDs were exaggerated to the point that even there were recommendations to preferring opioids over NSAIDs, for example, in seniors, in guidelines that were paid for more or less by drug companies. So as opioid prescribing for acute pain and chronic pain began to soar, starting in the late 90s, we started to see a decrease in the use of NSAIDs corresponding with the increase in the use of opioids. You had asked about policies to improve access to treatments for acute pain. I think that maybe one of the lessons is that we certainly want that. Maybe the real question is policies to improve the quality of care for acute pain, not necessarily access to more treatment, because I think the real harm has been overtreatment and overuse of opioids for acute pain, and this culture of a pill for every ill and an expectation that we should feel no pain. If you've just had surgery, if you've just had a serious accident, it should hurt. People shouldn't have the expectation that a doctor will completely eradicate your pain with a pill. And I think that's a message that we have to get out there.
I appreciate the idea of sort of the policies to improve access to appropriate care. And sticking with the clinical experts for just a minute, we've touched on this quickly, but the role of guidelines. And so are there recommendations, ideas about how we should be thinking about guidelines being updated to reflect the introduction of a new therapy? I know that payers, thank you, Vicki, for the positive body language already. I mean, payers look to this to help them guide how they think about coverage policies. Anything you can tell? I mean, I didn't ask you this ahead of time, not knowing how you're watching this area, but Dr. Friedman, sort of the guideline update process, important to ER docs so that they know sort of what the options are in front of them?
Yes, I think guidelines are important. I don't know that they move the needle that much, but guidelines get the podcast talking, and the podcasts impact people. So I think guidelines do do have some do have an important impact. The various organizations that I'm involved with do have a fairly robust process for developing guidelines and keeping the guidelines up to date, and so. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much needs to be done from outside. I think, so I can give sort of specific examples. I mean, I'm involved with the American Headache Society, for example, and they tend to update their guidelines, every 5 to 10 years. I'm on one of the committees for the American College of Emergency Physicians, and the same thing. There's, a lot of these organizations do take the guidelines quite seriously. The downside is, I think, this is sort of generational change. I mean, I think, when the guideline is written, it slowly begins to have an impact, and the sort of the true impact is probably felt over 10 years or so. So, yeah, as evidence-based treatments emerge, it slowly gets disseminated to the point that it needs to be.
So 2 quick reflections. One, I think it might be a first that one of the policy recommendations should include how we can influence podcasts to be talking about evidence-based care. So that's a new one. That is a sign of the times that might be a thing that we need to do. But I also appreciate the point about the generational change. I remember learning this factoid in graduate school that sometimes it takes 17 years for practice in medicine to sort of change and to disseminate. And, as a patient, you go, please, can we go faster than that? And so we'll look, and as we continue the conversation, sort of, and especially our final remarks of, call to action, so that we're not waiting 17 years to sort of undo some of the misinformation that's been out there, to highlight new treatment options and who's appropriate for those treatments, and don't wait 17 years for that kind of change. Dr. Kalani, anything to add on the guidelines piece?
On the guidelines, I would say I think guidelines can be influential, but it's for a guideline to weigh in on suzetrigine, it's too soon right now. We need. It'd be nice if there were more trial data, if we had the published papers, but also some clinical experience. And right now, I don't think it would be possible for a guideline committee to really make a recommendation one way or the other. If they did make a recommendation, it would be based on very weak evidence.
Got it. Okay, appreciate that. Jamie, just heading to you just for some manufacturer perspectives on some of these issues that have been brought up. So definitely feel free to comment on what you've heard. But I'm also specifically, your colleague who presented his public comments earlier touched on this. Given that we think a lot about the innovation signal that we're sending, right, about what we want in terms of what patients want, what the system wants, anything that you can share about why Vertex decided to try to innovate in this area? Been 20 years since anyone had done it. I think that the ecosystem would appreciate knowing sort of what the decisions were that were made that led us to this point.
Yeah, I think there's part of it that is, the Vertex strategy and how we discover and develop medicines for specific disease areas. And there's 2, I think, key components to that are very relevant here. One is diseases of high unmet need. And I think acute pain and pain in general, I think we heard a lot of that today. We saw it in the public comments. We know it ourselves. We know it from our friends and family. There is a tremendous unmet need here, I think, regardless of both from an inadequately managed pain perspective. I think patients will tell you that, oftentimes they feel that their pain is not managed to their expectations, whether those are, too high, as was discussed earlier. But, I think that pain relief is what people are looking for. And then, of course, the unfortunate, public health crisis we've been in for the past 10 years. So that's kind of the first piece. And the second is validated targets. So we don't develop medicines where we don't understand the causal biology or why that's happening. And so here, the sodium channel, the NaV 1.8 sodium channel, and I think Paul touched on this earlier, and there is actually a full mechanism of action published paper that folks can look at on exactly how the MOA works. So finding that specific validated target and then developing a medicine that can selectively target that specific sodium channel, and then developing, he talked about the Viper and the E-Viper, which I have seen it in person, it's pretty amazing, can actually test how selective it is. So when you put those two things together, the probability of success then in the clinic goes way up and you're addressing a high unmet need. So I think those are the two things that we are really core to how we think about, where we spend our time and energy discovering and developing medicines. And I think acute pain and then the NaV 1.8 channel and suzetrigine both fit directly in there. Does that answer your question?
That does. That was really helpful. I think about this a lot because, we ended up with 20 drugs for rheumatoid arthritis. That's great for people for rheumatoid arthritis, but there were all of these other conditions that there was no pipeline for. And so thinking about what signals we need to incentivize the areas where we still need effective treatment, I think is just a sort of helpful perspective. I'll go back to you, Jamie, but you prompted reactions. So Andrew, Nicole, Andrew, go ahead.
Yes. So certainly acute and chronic pain are highly prevalent. I think many of us in our lives frequently experience acute pain, unfortunately. But your statement that there's high unmet need, and I'm sure you have some data that you're thinking of when you say that. I'm just curious what it is that, what the support for that statement is, because we live in a country where in healthcare systems we're mandated to treat pain like it's a vital sign. We have to ask patients every several hours in hospitals whether or not what their pain is from 1 to 10. Even patients who are admitted to a hospital for a non-painful condition are being asked over and over again about their pain. So in the United States, the idea that we have an unmet need for treatment of pain. I'm just curious what you point to.
Yeah, I think I'll probably start with the more obvious part, which is the risks associated with opioids. So of the 80 million people that are treated for acute pain every year, half get exposed to an opioid. That's a fact. So, 40 million adults are getting exposed to an opioid every single year. And if you take the data that was utilized by ICER and that, have a large study on looking at the risk of opioid use disorder, that's diagnosed opioid use disorder, just in that first year, 85,000 of those people will go on to develop OUD. So this is not just a chronic pain problem that is contributing to the opioid epidemic. And I think you can't live in 2025 and not recognize that, a variety of approaches, including not limiting the use of opioids, has got to be part of the strategy in curbing that. And I think that unmet need is fairly recognized. The part that's maybe a little bit less recognized is surveys that we've done in patients and surveys that exist on patients with acute pain and chronic pain, but focusing on acute pain, where the pain is inadequately managed. So they're not able to, Dr. Friedman mentioned physical therapy, so that impacts their ability to start physical therapy and recover quicker. They have a concern about taking an opioid, so sit around and suffer in pain because they just don't want to take that opioid or they can't take that opioid. And so I think there's two sides of it, both the sort of more obvious things we're trying to avoid by not having as many people exposed to opioids. And then the maybe less obvious, which is that I think a lot of people would tell you that their pain is not managed in the way that they would like, or they're feeling more pain than they would like. And that has some downstream consequences related to, the ability to recover, the ability to get back to work, sort of all those sorts of things. And we've spent the last, in addition to research that's been out there, the last couple of years researching that and, administering both qualitative and quantitative surveys in patients who have had a variety of surgical procedures to really try to understand that better.
I appreciate that. And thank you for that question. And what I'm kind of sensing from how we'll think about this is both of those things can be true at the same time. Some of Dr. Kolodny's points about existing treatments that have been underused, maybe some misinformation that kind of contributed to some of that. And then also what that has done to the patient ecosystem of, regardless if it was misinformation or however it was, patients who are like, I don't want to take an opioid. And I don't think that ibuprofen is going to work for me. And yes, we have education that we can do on that, but I can see both of those things being true about sort of how we ended up where we were. Nicole, you were going to chime in.
Yes, I just wanted to also state, I mean, pain is the leading cause of disability in the United States. And when you are dealing with severe acute pain, it is disabling, just like chronic pain. And the big concern, I think, is pain is subjective. So it is really hard for individuals to effectively sometimes communicate the type of pain they're experiencing, how it is impacting their lives. Even in this acute pain setting, it can change sort of that time in your life. And acute pain that lasts for 3 months, that's a significant portion of time if you are living with it and suffering for that long. And I just don't think that people with pain are being heard to the point that they need to. One of the things, though, I think that is so important is that we really need more patient education out there, especially sort of when we're talking about acute pain and maybe that post-surgical portion, especially. What are some of those multimodal approaches that individuals can do at home that they can also incorporate with whatever pharmacological treatments that their provider is offering? Because really this is about as many tools in that toolbox as possible. And we also need to look at the expectation, right? The expectation for some is that there's going to be some pain, but we need to find out ways that we are managing it so that it is not becoming disabling for these individuals.
Appreciate that. Gabe, sorry, were you going to chime in on something? Did I see your hand? No. Okay, great. Just triple checking on that. Jamie, just back to you. I just given you the opportunity. Anything else that we've sort of been talking about, thinking about for the manufacturer perspective is important for us to have in our heads as we think about these policy options and recommendations.
I mean, I think the only other thing we haven't really touched on, but Nicole, I think, was maybe just touching on a little bit, is how acute pain can actually transition to chronic pain if not well managed in a way that a patient can recover from whatever it is that caused that acute pain. And so I think going back to the point on physical therapy and other things around recovery, pain management is not just about keeping somebody comfortable. It's actually about enabling a recovery that will, allow the patient not to then be living in chronic pain. So that's something we had not talked about, but I think Nicole is sparking the thought for me that I think it's important we put that on the table as well.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is it's one of those benefits beyond health. Like it's hard, you can model this, like you can put that in, but the idea that the availability of more and effective therapies means that we have less transition from acute to chronic, and that has all sorts of downstream impacts that we want. Vicki and David have been very patient. And so now it's time to talk about payers. And so, this part of the conversation it's going to feel a little technical. I'm going to be asking them some questions about coverage policy, utilization management, and how they're thinking about things. And just want to acknowledge that that's because most of us are going to get access to these therapies through a health insurance company that will write a policy about it. And so we want to see how we can have those policies reflect the best available evidence, reflect what we do and don't know, and even, let's think big, have opportunities to help us identify and bring in more information. We haven't talked about real world evidence yet, but when we get to sort of future research areas, how can policies and sort of what's happening on one side of the ledger be informing all the information I think that we want to know, sort of appropriate use, etc. All right, so Vicki and David, you can Rochambeau to see who goes first. But just thinking about sort of the coverage policy here, a couple of things that have been on my mind. Do you think about age of appropriate patients for this? Does that come into consideration as you guys are thinking about your coverage policies? Vicky, you can go first.
Yeah, I think for us, we're mostly treating a 65 and older population. So in fairness, I would say that it does come into consideration, not so much in the coverage policy, but in the body of evidence.
Right.
And like, how do we think about those patients? And I think this is one of the really hard things. I was actually going to jump in on the end there, and but it ties into how do you ultimately come up with a coverage policy, or what the criteria are, is in the studies, it's a 14-day period. It's this very clean scenario where the patient's having this procedure and then they're getting acute pain. That's not the real world of pain management. I don't know how frequently somebody should be able to repeat this therapy. Like if they have a acute pain episode today and then they have another one in 3 months, like, is that okay? We don't have that level of data. I also don't know, like, in the real world, patients may continue to have pain while on this medication and require an opioid. And so then the ability to avoid that opioid has kind of like gone away. And so a lot of these questions around, I would say, timing and duration of therapy are really some of the things that we don't just have any real world experience yet on. And the studies and the way that they reported are these just very clean clinical scenarios that don't reflect probably how this could be or may even be desired to be used in the real world setting. And that creates a lot of tension then in terms of how you think about how we will think about access.
Yeah. Well, I was going to get to, I'm glad you mentioned it, sort of duration of therapy. And I know that in other disease areas, and this is even a criteria that we developed in our fair access criteria, thinking about like, what are the criteria that make a lot of sense? Sometimes it's appropriate to mirror the clinical trial and think about that as your starting point while we get additional information. And so given that, it was a short course of therapy, we don't have data on what happens if you take it or 6 months later or for a longer period of time. It seems like some sort of limit on duration of therapy might be reasonable. Okay. Everyone else is going to have a chance to react to all of this. Don't worry. Sticking with Vicky and David right now. Vicky, sticking with you. The other thing that I had read in some work that was kind of being put out there, sort of policy guides for payers on this, was sort of limits on duration of therapy, but also the quantity limits piece. And I don't know how much of this is our reaction to the opioid use crisis, where someone got their wisdom teeth out and left with 60, right? And so like we've heard those stories. Does quantity limits something you guys are thinking about too?
I mean, I think anything in concordance with the way that it was studied. And so like
Okay.
a quantity limit would certainly be a way to think about how we can stay within the way that it was studied, because you're absolutely right. We have the evidence we have today. We know what we know today, and that typically drives where we're going to start.
Do you think step therapy makes sense for acute pain?
Oof. I think the challenge is that today this is in a relatively planned setting in the way that this drug was studied and treated. And that's, again, it's just very different than the way that the indication is and how it's going to be used in the real world. And so I realize that may sound like a little bit of like an evasive answer, but like,
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm putting you on the spot. No, that's all right. I'm putting David on the spot next. So David, anything that you can share about how you're thinking the quantity limits, the sort of duration of therapy, how are you thinking about structuring the policy, step therapy?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we would definitely have a quantity limit and duration limit. I mean, because the studies are very short studies, and all of a sudden we're going from acute to acute on chronic, which it wasn't studied.
Right.
So I think we would definitely be doing that. Where I struggle on this drug is, as you say, a step therapy or something that might not be appropriate if a person with history of OUD comes to the ER with a fractured arm. We might not want to do a step therapy type thing, delaying that person, especially if they can't take NSAIDs.
Right.
So I think this is a real struggle because the OUD crisis is real. The data presented, of the number that we could avoid is real. At the same time, I worry that for many physicians, it will be just second nature to just prescribe this because it's an easy thing. And how do we direct this medicine to the target population properly while ensuring that same people have easy access, at least for the initial prescription.
I appreciate that, and thank you. I was leading the witness a little bit there, probably with my own body language, just a little on the step there. It's also a matter of like timing. It's just like somebody shows up and they're in acute pain. The idea to try and put a PA in, it just doesn't seem that it'll necessarily make sense. But understanding that we have data on a particular, population, for a particular period of time. Before I get reactions to others on some of these coverage policy ideas for David and Vicky, any exclusions? Are any like patient populations not necessarily appropriate that you think might be part of some sort of coverage policy? Not holding you to anything you say, but just ideas.
The obvious one, which I feel a little bad, is pediatric population. Because, when you think about the 16 and 17-year-old population, I suspect has much higher risk of OUD. But we would exclude it based on the studies.
Just based on the study. Vicky, anything to add to that on sort of patient, populations excluded?
Not at this point. I mean, this has been said a few times, but maybe it can't be said too much. Getting the peer-reviewed publication will be so informative for how we think about that.
Yeah. So one thing that I want I'm going to ask, and I don't mean this flippantly, but I have an idea how some of you will feel about coverage policies and prior authorization. But it's, we want to get it out there and sort of the different perspectives, but also thinking about how we can continue, and then we'll shift soon to sort of research gaps. Like, what do we want? We've mentioned it a couple of times. So let's talk about what we need from the research enterprise, but that's also collective. How are payers gathering data that can be helpful to sort of understand the appropriate patient populations, et cetera. So keep that in mind as we're thinking of, again, asks for each other, but ways that the ecosystem can be supportive of learning more information and having that information help us know the appropriate patients. So let me start with the clinical experts. Dr. Kolodny, your thoughts on sort of how the payer coverage policy ecosystem can be supportive of appropriate use of this drug and other drugs for pain? And I think you're on mute.
A prior authorization, and I think this is why payers use them, can very effectively deter prescribing of a particular product because it becomes more of a headache. And it was very frustrating to me that their prior authorization for many years, when it came to prescribing opioids for acute or chronic pain, there was no prior authorization because they were often inexpensive or generic. Whereas buprenorphine, which I was using to treat opioid use disorder, required prior authorization. So here was a medication that would have a dramatic improvement in public health if more people had access to it. And yet there was that prior authorization barrier. Whereas the drugs that were causing the crisis, there was no prior authorization. Some payers have changed a little bit, but typically they're used to deter prescribing of more expensive medications. If we knew that this medication was very effective, and if we lived in an environment, let's say, where there were no NSAIDs, we had opioids and we had suzetrigine, and suzetrigine was effective, I would say there should be no prior authorization. This medicine, this molecule will have such an improvement to public health, it should be available without prior auth. But that's not really the case. Its efficacy is unclear, and we have NSAIDs, which are very effective even for severe pain.
Thank you. Dr. Friedman?
I think I'm really just going to repeat what I said before, which is that it would be great if the payers had a real interest in the long-term outcomes and not just the short-term outcomes. And as highlighted in the analysis we saw today, in the economic analysis that we saw today, if you're considering the long-term outcomes, the decision, to fund it changes, is definitely much more in the benefit, much more on the side of benefit for the payers. But that's not the reality that we live in. So, then we rely on the public insurers to make that calculation. But yeah, I totally agree though that the hurdles that providers have to leap over provide or a real barrier to prescribing the medications.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Nicole, to you, then Gabe, then Jamie.
Well, I just want to say that I agree with Dr. Friedman, and I think that we need to make sure that we are making this accessible, and that individuals have the opportunity, if it is deemed appropriate with the provider, to have this medication. And I do want to just talk a little bit further about severe pain and acute pain, because I do think we need more options out there. I don't think that just having the NSAIDs and opioids alone is enough, because NSAIDs aren't working for everybody, and people need opioids because they need something to control their pain. And so we need more novel therapeutics. We need more treatments out there, but we also need to make sure that individuals can access them in a timely manner, because if we prolong unnecessary suffering, we are getting back to that whole point of potentially leading individuals to transition from an acute pain to chronic pain. And that's only going to put more of a burden on our healthcare system.
So as we think about ways that the policies can be evidence-based, appropriate, easy to use, supporting the appropriate use so that we have the sort of downstream benefits. Okay, thank you. Gabe, anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think I have anything to add beyond that. I think the experts here have done a wonderful job.
Yeah, well, don't underestimate your expert status as having to navigate insurance. And so I think many of us.
You're right. I can share stories of having an easier time going up on dosage and opiates than down, and craziness like that. But I don't think that's helpful in this setting,
It's a good reminder that sometimes we can look at policies with that in mind.
Access is important.
Access is important. Jamie, from a sort of reflecting on coverage policies perspective, what would you like us to have in our heads as we think about some recommendations here?
Yeah, I think a lot has already been said as it relates to prior authorization of step therapy not being clinically appropriate for this particular situation, because, pain, acute pain peaks even from a surgical procedure in the first 72 hours. So you don't want people waiting for a therapy that's going to work for them. And I think that's been clearly stated by others. I think the other consideration is on, the quantity. That acute pain is, 30 to up to 90 days even. And I think some situations and some procedures, do require a slightly longer duration than others. I think people are used to some of these very short durations because opioids have utilization management for a different reason. But of course, here there are, situations where, of course, patients may need, longer than exactly what was studied. And I think if we are not allowing that, then that opens the door for the use of opioids. And I think NSAIDs have been discussed a lot, but the reality is that over half of patients who have acute pain are getting an opioid. So that is what is happening. And that, I think, is where people will go if, they don't have if people are still in pain and they need to manage that. So I think those are things that are very real and that we need to think about. And I think everybody agrees that, one of the main benefits here is avoiding all of those, really deleterious effects of opioids. And for that to be realized, then, suzetrigine would need to be able to be used to the best of its ability to work in patients and adequately manage their pain.
One way we could think about making a recommendation here, or just identifying some of the options, is that perhaps quantity limits, perhaps a limit on renewal, but with a pathway to very easily get through that for particular procedures that might have a longer duration of pain, for yes, particular situations where that might make a lot of sense. You could see that having the ability to um, uh, do a little prior off, a little down the road is not quite as onerous as what we're trying to think about, like in the acute moment, and where some prior auth, some step therapy, or other things might not make a ton of sense. So that's one thing that we can think about, because it is more expensive than what we're using. And we don't want to only focus on expense. We want to talk about value. And that's why we do the model, and our model with certain assumptions was actually showing cost saving. That's why I made the probably bad joke about comparing it to a gene therapy, right? It's like you pay a lot now for benefit that comes later from avoided things. But you can see that certain systems, just from a budget impact perspective, might want to limit the quantity. Also, because you don't want, 50 pills sitting in somebody's thing that don't get used that you paid for, right? Because then that's another consideration as we think about being stewards of resources. Okay, so thanks for that. Two things kind of in the weeds, and then we're going to shift to research gaps. Are there good predictive models to know patients who have a higher risk of developing opioid use disorder that could make it easier to know for whom this would be sort of an easy yes, suzetrigine versus some of the other or a cheaper alternative? Dr. Kalani?
No, there's no way to predict in advance. So there are so-called risk assessment tools.
Okay.
For example, a little screening tool that you give to a patient where they answer questions about personal or family history of mental health problems or substance use, and it's supposed to generate a score that will tell you what their risk of developing opioid use disorder is. That tool has been proven not to work. There's also a recently approved by FDA genetic test that's supposed to tell you somebody's risk of opioid use disorder, which is also just, despite its recent approval, has just a study just came out proving that test as well doesn't work. It can't predict OUD any better than a coin flip, and a large group of geneticists are petitioning the FDA to reverse its approval. So we have no way to predict in advance who will develop opioid use disorder. And when it comes to highly addictive drugs, it's not like alcohol where a subset of the population is at risk, and most people can use alcohol repeatedly with low risk of developing alcoholism. With highly addictive drugs like heroin, nicotine, oxycodone, hydrocodone, with highly addictive drugs, almost anyone who uses it repeatedly is going to be at high risk. So that's just something to keep in mind. And just last point, we've talked about maybe this is a medicine for people with OUD. For a patient with OUD who's in remission on, say, buprenorphine or methadone, that's a patient who I'm actually less concerned about exposing to opioids because they already have OUD. If it's a patient with OUD who's in recovery, not on medicines, yes, I would be worried. But for a patient it's really people without OUD that we don't want to give them this life-threatening condition.
That distinction is important. Thank you. Another in the weeds one, and then David and Vicky, coming to you before we go to research. Just want to get back to cost sharing and tiering, just so we can hear some reflections on that. A lot of this use might be in a surgical setting where a lot of providers are getting paid a bundled payment to sort of treat. Right. So again, we're kind of in the weeds here about our system. Are we worried, or how do we think about the incentive or the disincentive to use a more expensive therapy in a bundled payment setting? And do we need to sort of have a recommendation or some sort of exposure to this potentially being a challenge for access? Has anyone been thinking about that issue? Kind of open to anyone who sort of thinks about the bundled payment situation for surgery. Is it more like write the prescription, they go home with it, it's not going to be part of the bundle? David, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the thing. As far as I know, it's not part of the bundle.
Bundled?
So
Okay, all right. So
I
I
don't think there's
warned
any
it was a
effect.
very technical, nerdy question. Go
Yeah.
ahead, David, please. Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. All right, well, we won't worry about that one. David and Vicky, back to David, you kind of started this. We'll start with you, but sort of that for a lot of your plan sponsors, any branded drug is just on the highest tier, can't do much about it, can't, place it on a lower tier. Is there any way out of that you can see, or like what are the options here so that cost sharing doesn't necessarily become a barrier to access for patients?
I, off the top of my head, can't think of a way around it. I mean,
well, it only costs $200. So like, what's the most that we think is gonna, right?
and it just depends on the person's
Depends on the
individual
plan
plan.
design.
Some plans have low cost share, some, the high deductible plans, which I'm on, it's an $8,000 cost share.
So it would be full price would be what you would
Full price, yeah.
hadn't met your deductible yet. I guess that's true of any sort of high deductible plan.
Yeah.
Vicky, anything that you're thinking about from the tiering and the cost sharing perspective, same sort of reality, just new medicine that's branded is going to end up on a higher tier?
I think yes is the short answer. I think then it comes down to like within, this is one drug and we're looking at the host of things and how we offer a affordable package for our patients. And so I think that we do look at different drugs and what's in line with Chapter 6 and CMS requirements in terms of how we tier medications. So that's a long answer to say, I think it really does depend on some of the long-term efficacy of the data to some extent of if we would consider a different tiering strategy that changed the copayment. Not unheard of, but with this amount of evidence, I think not as likely.
I will volunteer that one of the criteria that we came up with in our fair access criteria, what could it look like, is when a drug is priced appropriately, we want to make sure it or a therapeutic alternative is on the lowest relevant tier. And I'll just put out there for everyone to be thinking about, does that mean it's okay if, NSAIDs, which we're getting over the counter, are sort of the lowest relevant tier? Just that I don't think we want to necessarily say opioids are a therapeutic alternative here, because the whole point is to have a therapy that would mean you didn't have to use opioids and have that risk with it. So just an invitation to think about the ways that cost sharing might impact patient access. And given that, and yes, caveats about how you feel about the pricing all withstanding, our model is showing this drug is actually priced in a way that could save the system money, which is more what we kind of want out of that grand bargain that I started with. All right, rapid fire. I'm going to call on each of you for your sort of research area, the thing you wish we knew or that we can focus on having real world evidence developed over time to help us answer. And then after that, we'll do a round robin for final call to action or final reflections from today. And this time we'll start with the payers. So David, you're going to go first. Research needs. What's your ask?
Oh, pediatrics and long-term chronic pain.
I love the succinctness of that. Thank you. Vicky?
Long-term, and specifically, does this avoid members getting opioids down the road later on? I think that is a really strong, outstanding question that the rest of this all kind of hinges on. And so I think that's really important.
I think Jamie's going to be taking a lot of notes about what the research needs are here. Gabe, anything from the patient perspective, things you wish you knew about this medicine for you and your community?
As much information as is possible, specifically, but I mean, for research needs, definitely chronic.
Chronic, yeah, that's
Absolutely.
fair. As much as I said we weren't going to talk about chronic, I get it. I mean, that's where we're interested.
Yeah,
Nicole?
sorry.
Oh, no, not at all.
I'm actually going to say the same as David. I think looking at pediatric and long-term for chronic pain.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Friedman?
Sure. So yeah, so many questions. I mean, we really don't have a great.
You're not limited to one. You can do a couple. Go ahead.
I mean, what exactly is the role of this medication as monotherapy and then as part of multimodal therapy. So, that's with regard to acute and across the acute indication. So, is it as good for, long bone fracture as it is for migraine, as it is for post, abdominoplasty patients? So that's number one. And then, is it better to prescribe it with NSAIDs, or is it better to prescribe it as monotherapy? And then, this question that's been raised before about disrupting the transition from acute to chronic pain. I mean, does it have a role? And that would be particularly like among patients with back pain or the patients who are at sort of higher risk for transitioning to chronic pain.
Thank you. Dr. Chladni.
I'd like to see a head-to-head with NSAIDs, and
Right.
since we know it's likely to be used long-term off-label for chronic pain, it'd be nice to see what the long-term adverse effects are from use.
And safety piece. Jamie, do you want to make any research needs to yourself?
No, but I can at least comment on a few of the ones
Please
that
go right ahead.
have been raised. So, based on FDA guidance, we do have post-marketing commitments for pediatrics. So it sounds like that
That's
is important to folks. We also have quite a few planned studies in other pain models and some of the other areas that people are interested in. So we are committed to continuing to study suzetrigine, in a variety of settings, and also in the real world going forward. And then I think, as most people are aware, although we won't spend too much time talking about it, we are advancing this molecule through for chronic pain as well. So just to say, a lot of what you said it is on our radar, and it's helpful to hear what you're continuing to be interested in.
Great. I had my own list. I'm just going to throw that out there for, again, sort of body language reactions for this. Clinical trials assessing other patient-important outcomes like physical and mental quality of life, and just some of the other things that we know patients sort of care about, with all acknowledgement that Vertex designed their trial in concert with the guidelines FDA has for studying pain. We talked about side effects, sort of that long-term after we get more use. This isn't a research need, but we talked about it. Can't wait for publishing the peer-reviewed trials. We're all excited about that. That transition piece was important for me too, Dr. Friedman. Do we know that this is helping stop patients transition from acute to chronic? Head-to-head comparisons. Thank you, Dr. Chladni mentioned that. Interestingly, we didn't identify this necessarily as a problem, but there were very few men in the clinical trial program, just given who typically gets abdominoplasty and bunionectomy. So just a call for more inclusivity in sort of the trials and in the information, probably a role for real world evidence that we can gather some more information. Not that we necessarily expect a gender difference, but just kind of naming that. I think those were some of the big ones that I had. So here we are, almost at the end. And again, deep gratitude for everyone spending 90 minutes talking about a new medicine for acute pain. I know it was an exciting way for me to spend my afternoon, but this is your chance to sort of have a call to action and ask of somebody, like, I really wish X would happen. Or just a reflection on what you want to make sure is in our heads as we go to finalize our report, which will be a reflection of sort of how do we get to evidence-based policies for affordable access for this new medicine. So Gabe, you get to go first. Any call to action?
Yeah, a better transition care. I think that's the best one, is anything that can be done in that regard.
Meaning from acute to chronic, just how we're managing patients in that journey. Thank you, Gabe. I really appreciate that. Nicole.
Pain affects millions of individuals, and we really need to start looking at the fact that this is detrimental and sometimes leads to lifelong effects, and we need more options out there. There isn't enough that we have access to or that we are able to utilize on an equity level, especially for all individuals. And so access has to be considered. We need to make sure that all patients that are living with pain, not just some, receive these different types of treatments that are available and are coming to market. And this is really an exciting time. It's a promising time for people with pain. But we need to make sure that we're always focused in on if there are that long-term effect, and making sure that even if it's something that's going to cost a little bit more now, if it's effective and safe, that we have access to it so that it can improve health outcomes for others going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Freeman.
I guess I would direct my call specifically to Vertex to, continue to generate a lot of data so we could see how to use this medication.
It's a good one. Dr. Cloudney.
So for a broad call to action, I think that we are still massively overprescribing opioids in the United States. Yes, prescribing has trended in a more cautious direction, which means fewer Americans are becoming newly addicted to opioids, but we're still prescribing far more than other countries. We're still unnecessarily exposing patients to opioids. We're prescribing opioids in doses and durations far greater than are needed, and we're prescribing opioids for conditions where NSAIDs would be more appropriate. So I'd like to see more cautious prescribing. And also I would agree with Dr. Friedman. As far as Vertex, I think they should publish in a peer-reviewed journal their findings.
Excellent. Jamie.
Yeah, I would say, suzetrigine phase 3 data shows that it's safe and effective in the treatment of acute pain, and that, I hope that we all keep the patient at the center of how we think about pain management from the two sides that I talked about earlier, both ensuring that we can adequately manage people's pain after a variety of painful episodes, and that we are able to avoid the use of opioids and hopefully bend that curve going forward, because the opioid epidemic is still very real and present. And every time we can prescribe an alternative to an opioid, that's one less potential case of opioid use disorder and everything that comes along with that, including a high risk of mortality, every time we can do that.
Thank you, Jamie. Vicki.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say, as Humana thinks about this, we put the patient at the center of all the decisions that we're making in terms of our coverage decisions. Again, trying to get to that right outcome for the right member at the right time. And I think the things that we need to do that to be partners in this system is the peer-reviewed evidence. And then I want to hit on, because this came up a few times, the guideline directed therapy and what's the place of this agent in therapy in relation to those multimodal tools that we all talked about. Because I think everyone here has acknowledged that really addressing the opioid epidemic as a public health priority needs that multimodal approach. And the more that we can have that guideline directed care, the better it is to make those decisions across the evidence base.
Thank you, Vicki. Last word to David.
Two things. One, just more data for it to be published. But second, I would just say the information from the ICER cost modeling of the benefit has really changed how I look at this medication. Just a tornado thing, and it really is fascinating when you look at the cost benefit. Even if you consider it not a very effective medication, but some benefit.
I did not pay David to say nice things about our model to end our roundtable today. But I mean, truly, we do this work to help inform sort of evidence-based policymaking. And so we think that cost effectiveness is one of those tools that can help elucidate the comparative clinical effectiveness. We also believe our independent counsel brings such important perspectives to adjudicating and thinking about that evidence. And we think you all are super important to think about what this means to actual policy making. So my deep gratitude for all of you to having spent time with us today to offer these perspectives. We look forward to summarizing this in our policy recommendations in our final report. And this was the first time that I moderated the policy roundtable, and y'all made it easy. So thank you for that. I really appreciate. Oh, well, thank you. But I really appreciate everyone spending time with us today and these excellent perspectives. And Jill, it's my pleasure to turn things back over to you for final reflections from our Midwest CEPAC.
Okay, well, thank you all for being part of this today. And I guess we'll start with hang on just a second. We'll go backwards. We'll start with Stuart on any last thoughts of today's discussion.
Sure. I found today's discussion to be quite rich. I really appreciated the input from all stakeholders. As a clinician who used a cadre of less selective sodium channel blockers for cardiac arrhythmias all through my career, found the ability of the scientists to develop a highly selective sodium channel blocker impressive. And I suspect this will facilitate further innovation that I look forward to seeing. So again, kudos to the technology and innovation.
Jimmy. Jimmy.
Yeah, sorry. I think for me, it's just I want to bring forth, the fact that we've, kind of neglected, and this is in an attempt to get that equitable access to pain management. I really want to encourage the, the the creation of more data on the use of cannabis for pain management. I believe that might have been overlooked, obviously because it's been highly stigmatized, and I understand it's non-pharmacological, but I think that it fits in right with the multimodal use, and they can be used as rescue as well. But I just want to encourage that it's looked at more, and there's a lot more patient-reported benefits, and there's a lot of more evidence that this is a really good way to manage pain. So I want to encourage that it's brought to light more and not be shrouded in mystery.
Thank you, Jimmy. David Kim.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm a health economist, and I do this cost-effective analysis for living. But I really, honestly, I never struggle so much to determine interventions value when cost-effective modeling actually shows that health improving and cost-saving result. And my struggle, as many of our panels alluded earlier, that it really stems from substantial uncertainty of short and long-term clinical efficacies, adverse effects, with a lack of direct head-to-head trials with the NSAID. So I believe that drug has a potential to be high value, but we definitely need more data to truly determine the long-term value of the cetirizine.
Thank you, Jayani.
Yeah, so I enjoyed the discussion today, but I'm also in the idea of we need more data and innovation, especially I struggle a lot with not having the comparison with the NSAIDs, because we know, the opioids is option, if OUD is not an adverse effect with the estrogen, but what about the comparison with NSAIDs, right? If somebody doesn't want to get opioid, they turn to NSAIDs, but is this estrogen better than NSAIDs for me to take it as a patient, etc. So that, and also obviously looking at more on different populations. I think some members of the panel talked about that. We need more data on how effective is this drug on other patient populations as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy McBride, I didn't mean to overlook you, so you're next.
I was wondering if you were doing that on purpose. I'm just kidding. So I just want to thank you, Jill, for expert leadership, and Sarah, congratulations, great job. You got a lot of potential to keep doing this, I think. So, and thanks to the ICER team for a great hard work. I'll echo what I just heard my colleagues say. Although on the surface, it might have seemed kind of a simple story, and the numbers kind of said that when you dig under the surface, it was complex. I like in a lot of these meetings, there's a lot of meat to chew on. I would have loved to have seen peer-reviewed articles. I would have loved to have seen more data. I would have loved to have seen more evidence on diversity, know more about that. Sort of the right comparison studies to be able to make more definitive votes than I was able to do. Because I'm, as a person like probably everybody in the screen who's suffered from pain in my life in a couple different ways, I know this is an important issue, but so I wanted to vote definitively, but I didn't feel like I was able to. just because the evidence just wasn't in front of us. But that's not ICER's fault.
Thank you. Heather.
Absolutely. I just really wanted to, join my colleagues in saying that I as well look for more data. I would love to come back and vote on this again with more resounding higher marks because this is something I absolutely believe in. Pain management generally is an incredibly critical topic. We still struggle with ongoing disparities. We struggle with undertreatment, particularly in marginalized communities. So I'm very glad to see the rising tide trying to lift all of the boats. And I want to, of course, thank all of the experts, all the clinicians, all the researchers who shared their insights today. Of course, ICER always for the opportunity. But the most important message I want to give is to the patient representatives. Your voices are so important, and I appreciate so much your vulnerability in sharing your real world context, your expertise, your lived experiences. You drive the work forward, and I look forward to following your lead towards more compassionate and effective care. So thank you.
Thank you. Inge.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great. Well, I haven't lived through the COX-2 debacle. I'm a gastroenterologist. I would love to see non-steroidal effects on the GI system reduced with something that's new. But, not knowing whether this new drug will actually be better than non-steroidals, if patients come back and demand their opioids, the entire benefit that sort of hinges on the reduction of opioid use disorders will evaporate. And without that knowledge, so as a guideline methodologist, I would have to have head-to-head against non-steroidals. They need to show that they're better than non-steroidals. Once you get that hurdle out of the way, and once we have some, indication that it doesn't do anything on the kidney, and I'm a liver doctor, so on the liver, it's going to be nice. It's going to be really nice. I really wish I'm wrong that I'm not having to be that pessimistic, but at this point, it probably won't change what I do in clinical practice every day. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Sneha.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I also think in terms of data transparency, one thing that we've really struggled with as a patient, myself and as a patient group, is the lack of access, like open access to some of this data. So would just really encourage both timely access and transparency for any data that comes about, especially post-market surveillance. We've had a lot of challenges with looking at multidisciplinary reviews and finding information redacted from there, for example. So we just really encourage you all and everybody here to continue pushing for that, because patients and patient groups are looking for this information. Going along those lines, I also would really encourage greater data disaggregation based on age. I know I say this repeatedly, but I think it's really important for us to think more intentionally about young adults versus adults and older adults above the age of 18, because we are a growing demographic with multiple chronic conditions, and a lot of us do have profound surgeries as well, even at these young ages. So I think that's really crucial. The last thing I'll just say is, there has been so much media surrounding this therapeutic, and while that's amazing, I do encourage a closer look at the way that it's being portrayed, and making sure that when the information is being communicated to patients, that it's done in a way that is correlated directly with the efficacy and safety information that exists, and that it's not done in a misleading way, because that can be harmful both for patient trust, but also just for the perception of this therapeutic when we don't necessarily have all the evidence that we would like. So.
Very good points, Sneha. Thank you. Gregory.
My principal position is as a medical journal editor. And so a threshold requirement for me is rigorous peer review and publication in a peer-reviewed journal before I'm willing to render any kind of judgment. about the efficacy of this drug. The only peer-reviewed literature there really is for us to look at in a top journal are the phase 2 trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine, along with 2 editorials. And together, that published literature in the New England Journal raises significant questions about whether this is an efficacious drug. And so it's a bit puzzling to me that we don't have the phase 3 trials peer-reviewed and published in front of us, and yet we're being asked to make judgments about the efficacy of this drug compared to other drugs without really being able to see the data and do a proper assessment of efficacy. So I think that skepticism is reflected in the voting that we did today, where my interpretation of the votes is there's uncertainty among the advisory council about this drug. The FDA, of course, can do what it wants. It's not a peer-reviewed journal. It has its own procedures, and it can make its own decisions. But I think ultimately, we as physicians have to make our own decisions about whether we're going to actually utilize this drug without having seen any peer-reviewed information. And I wouldn't do it.
Thank you for your comments, Gregory. Dawn.
Yeah, first I want to congratulate our fearless leader who threw herself into the deep end of the pool and ended up winning the gold medal in the 800 individual medley, and did an excellent job of, if you closed your eyes and listened, you heard a lot of Steve Pearson there. So thank you, Sarah, for a great job. I also have to disclose, and I don't want to embarrass Greg, but I do have to disclose that I serve frequently, as I think he knows, as a peer reviewer in many of the JAMA articles. So what I'm going to say is couched with the disclosure that he didn't pay me one dime to fully agree with what he just said. Okay, but I do think that's important because, and I was happy for all the experts, and I know that the clinical experts spent some time on guidelines, but I think in particular, Nicole and Victoria Brown also really got it right in terms of the 2 things that I think are needed for Jamie and Vertex. It seems to me as though Vertex should be testing this drug in more diverse settings at what I'll call the very high or far end of the pain scale, because that's where, the 10 worst pain of your life is likely to, result in some sort of starting point with an opioid, more likely. I'm telling this because like Dr. McBride, I also have lots of experience with both acute and chronic pain. And that, in particular, the area that I think has the most opportunity is acute low back pain. And I also want to highlight that while we got into it a little bit, I don't see as much utility, shall we say, of using better patient-reported outcome measures in the studies. And I think that really needs to be enhanced, Sarah, in terms of thinking through these things. And the last thing, and this is sort of what I think Victoria was talking about, is to test the real-world evidence embedded in existing guideline-directed multimodal peri and post-operative care plans. I have had a number of these surgeries where I have had elective surgeries where I've had preoperative care plans that include an extensive set of plans for pain control. And I've become aware of the the paradigm of the ERAS, the Enhanced Recovery After Surgery guidelines that are extensive, and I can put the link to them in the chat here, but certainly the very rapid growth of these procedures to ambulatory surgery centers is a big place where I think there's a gap to fill with in terms of peri and postoperative pain management, knowing that they aren't necessarily all going to be, in most cases, multimodal. So trying to keep it separate, it's a good starting point, but to highlight what Greg said, I think this adds some ideas for future studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Bijan?
All right. It's kind of hard to comment at the last because I'm going to be echoing almost everything my colleagues have said. And first, thanks, ICER, for giving me this opportunity. And again, this is, this is a very novel technology, and I wish I could be basically opined very positively. But again, I think as some of my colleagues already mentioned that it is, some evidence is not kind of overwhelming. And one of my issues is the very fact that placebo could be one of the arms. It kind of, you wonder whether this chronic acute situation can be transferred or can be generalized to a chronic situation. That's sort of one thing. And the other thing that I was also thinking in terms of the design of the study, they put in so much effort. Why they muddied the water with kind of, allowing NSAIDs in there? So it would have been like, I think basically making the point about it would be really good to have head-to-head trial even with NSAID or ibuprofen as well. And the other important thing is in terms of post approval surveillance, one thing I could imagine is that, for example, ibuprofen, it is sort of, it is out of over-the-counter medication. Now that would be, how you capture that information would be going to be really crucial. And I think next 2, 3, 4 years would be really important for us to really look at the long-term basically efficacy as well as related adverse events and other things. So I think it would be interesting to see how this would pan out in the real world in next 4 or 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan?
I guess I'm officially last. Is that the case? No. Oh, you get to go last. Wonderful. Well, I'll leave you 2 more. All right. Well, never. Then I will be brief. I would be brief anyway. But I'll try to come up with something that's a little different than maybe what colleagues have already said. And when I think about, to me, I kind of think about how interesting the cost effectiveness analysis was when you've got an example of a short-term cost differential. And then over the long run, there's some benefit that may separate, this therapy from opioid use because you have a concentrated risk and cost in a small population that for them, it's, to avoid that is significant. But when you play it out across a population, the effect is smaller. I wonder if this is a place I'm going to channel my inner Lou Garrison here to think about the, using a novel aspect of the value equation to think about the value of knowing. So for someone like me, who apparently has a life, inherently adrenaline junkie, clumsy, with apparently some of the weakest soft tissue and bones ever created, I have constant need for chronic acute pain. Just as an example, twice in the last 2 years, I've separately broken 5 ribs and 8 ribs. So I certainly value, for me, knowing, and I didn't take anything with opioid in it explicitly when I probably could have, was a great, and have bottles of it that I'd never used, but I'm just using that as an example of saying for the value of, having something that's a better option than just rotating through NSAIDs and, Tylenol and Advil, that I know isn't going to create some addiction risk for me or my family. I think there's a lot of value in that is accrued, that could be somehow captured and expressed, even in a short-term sense, that is missing here from this. So maybe this is an opportunity to think about some different ways to look at value or think about some novel value drivers that we haven't been able to incorporate here. That's just the value of knowing that there's less risk or not a risk for opioid addiction from, from a therapy that's, at least based on what we have, the evidence we have seems to have some equal efficacy as opioids.
Thank you. Eric.
I'll just give my props to Dr. Kerfman and his beautiful summary of the evidence or lack thereof in this case, and highlighting a very important difference between this group and the FDA. So this was a particularly thoughtful conversation that covered a much wider set of topics than the FDA would consider when allowing a drug to go to market. But that was not the call for this particular group to work today, and it really never has been. We're not saying, should the drug be on the market? We're saying, here are the contextual factors to consider, including money, when it comes into use. And I think that the split votes in many ways, or the uncertainty, are clearly reflected in the votes. The difference of opinions and things like caregiver burden and others are reflected, in the votes, maybe more so in this particular case than many others that this Midwest CEPAC has taken on. And so I just want to say thanks for giving the Midwest CEPAC a great public health crisis topic that has a new candidate to drive quality of care. So thank you for all the conversation today. But again, special props to Dr. Kerfman on his summary.
Thank you, Eric. I couldn't agree more. I'm happy to go last because I really don't have to come up with anything unique, because I just reiterate everything that you guys said just now. I couldn't say it better, including the props for Dr. Kerfman. Also, Sneha, you brought up some really great points. Each of you brought up really great points. And Sarah, you did a fantastic job today. Thank you all. I appreciate your input and your patience with me and my terrible voice. So thanks. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you to the Midwest CEPAC. I think we have one final slide that we can show everyone as we wrap up today about what to expect. We will be posting the recording of this meeting next week. The final report that will reflect everything that we discussed today will be published on or around March 27th. And you can find all of the materials we talked about today and the ones that we will publish in about a month on the ICER website. Deep gratitude to Jill for her fantastic chairmanship of today's, or chairship of today's meeting, and to all of our participants and all of our CEPAC members. I will echo Jill's call for a great weekend. Thank you, everybody.